Okay, we are ready to start Chapter 2 of Cambridge Ancient History, Volume 1, Part 1. Again, the original idea here is to not just read through it, but actually to stop and consider what is being said and look at words that maybe are new, that we don't understand. But also because my main channel is teaching English as a second language, I kind of have the goal of trying to explain things in very simple English, the things that I've read, which achieves a selfish goal to help me better understand what I'm reading, but also to explain to people whose English may not be so good. So we'll start reading this. If you're watching me read this live and you want me to go back and read something, or you have a comment or a question about a word, then please just leave a comment in the chat and I will be happy to go back over it if we can. Okay, so let's get started with Chapter 2 of Cambridge Ancient History, Neolithic and Bronze Age Cultures. Let me just get this situated here. Okay. The Highland Zone and the Alpine Man. What then was going on meanwhile within the Highland Zone? For several reasons, evidence from this region is very scanty. So that means there isn't very much evidence. Much of it is ill-explored from every point of view. Still more, and especially in its best explored West End, where later periods are exceptionally well exhibited and have been carefully studied, is out of reach for the same reason as is so much the evidence for interglacial man elsewhere, namely that the nearer we approach the centers of glaciation, the more completely do later glacial deposits cover the surfaces of the earlier. So that in Switzerland and South Germany, for example, human record hardly begins before the Neolithic age. Further southeast, the scale of accident is loaded the other way, for in proportion as glacial action passes into pluvial, it is not excess of deposits, but the wholesale removal of them by rain-fed torrents that limits observations. So because of the rain, a lot of the evidence has disappeared, in other words. A very large proportion of the land surface of Asia Minor, for instance, has no... I'm sorry, I'm still trying to get this situated. I thought I had everything done. Okay, let's try this again. I'm finding my mojo. A very large proportion of the land surface of Asia Minor, for instance, has no surface deposits in the ordinary sense at all. Even in the greater valleys, which are themselves rare, the upper terrace gravels have been severely dissected, and the lower have been covered by alluvium, deposited often within historic times. Consequently, it is almost exclusively by inference from other data, such as the distribution of racial types today, and certain indications of the course of events in immediately prehistoric times, that the prehistory of this great region must be reconstructed provisionally. So they're not going by the evidence that they find in the ground, but more, if I understand this correctly, they're going more by the racial makeup of the region. Now, limiting conditions are supplied by the climate, vegetation, and consequent mode of existence imposed here upon man in general. Like all other highlands, this literally alpine zone has always had a cooler, moister climate, and the lowlands north and south of it in periods when the submerged areas on its Mediterranean and Sarmatian flanks were extensive. This humidity was greatly accentuated. it must be inferred from this that the whole region has been predominantly and persistently a forest area. General changes of temperature would replace subtropical by temperate or subarctic species, but would not necessarily alter the forest area. Let me just see that general changes of temperature would replace subtropical by temperate or subarctic species, but not so. So the non-forest area may have been influenced, but not much the forest area. A period of general drought would draw the forest margin inwards and upwards among the foothills. A pluvial period would expand it into the plains, and a heavy snow cap would devastate it among the peaks and ridges, and down the glaciated valleys. But none of these agencies would avail to destroy the forest regime altogether. That catastrophe was reserved for the hand of man, and even man has not devastated it wholly as yet. So the forest seemed to survive quite a few tragedies or weather disasters, but they always survived until humans took over, and then humans were very intent on destroying this area. But they haven't yet, or at least at the time of this writing, they haven't. It follows that the grassland and parkland fauna, whether African or Arctic, which is so widely associated elsewhere with the first signs of man's presence, did not pervade the highland zone at all generally. In alluvial valleys and in the large intermont plains and forelands such as the Danube Valley, which are characteristic of the region and were reserved to grassland by their mantle of interglacial loess. Remember, loess is a geological term. The deposits, it's kind of a yellowish deposit left by, I think it was glaciers. Now let's check again. And this is my third time checking this term, loess. I even remember what it looks like from the picture, but let's see. Loosely compacted yellowish gray deposit of wind-blown sediment, of which extensive deposits occur in eastern China and American Midwest. We'll just take a look at it again, just so we can, if you're new to this, if you're new to this adventure, you can see a picture of loess, Loess, and I guess that's how you pronounce it. Let me see where I am here. Okay, so this is loess. It's kind of a yellowish soil. I guess it's not very good for growing things. It doesn't seem to be. Okay. Well, since I'm doing this, let me hear the pronunciation that Google has.
Less.
Oh, actually, it's less. I've been saying lowest for some reason, but less. Less. I guess I'll have to say it like that from now on. Okay, less. Let's see. Where are we? Man hunting in the open, as he hunted in the lowlands of Western Europe or on the great steppes and parklands, had therefore no inducement to occupy the forest area. At most, his mode of subsistence brought him along the larger rivers, such as the Danube and its tributaries. It is significant that all of the earlier individuals whose remains have been found hitherto within the highland zone are of the Neanderthal type, and the only large group of Neanderthal men hitherto recorded is that from the Krapina cavern in the headwaters of the Save, and that almost all the Neanderthal men have been found along the western outliers of the highland core of Europe. To draw conclusions from the distribution of so few examples is risky, and the fragments from Kent's Cavern and one of the Gibraltar caves impose caution already. But there is another reason for expecting that the Neanderthal type may be found to represent an early forest man, differentiated by his surroundings as well as by long descent from his Aurignacian contemporaries on the grasslands and parklands outside. Whatever the relations of Neanderthal man to highland zone, the Aurignacian stock, at all events, seems to have originated elsewhere, and to have only penetrated it locally and marginally. Here again, however, it is possible that the Aurignacian relics scattered nearer its core may have been obliterated by the last outspread of glacial debris, and these last glacial deposits are sufficiently widely distributed to show that in the period which in Western Europe is the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic culture, practically the whole of the main highland was divested, not only of any human population it may have harbored interglacially, but of all save the most alpine vegetation. In any case, we know enough about the changes of climate within the glacial period to presume wide oscillation of contrasted types of man as the forest spread or shrank again. As the highland was surrounded from northeast to southwest by tundra and cold steppe, while southward and eastward its slopes were washed by Mediterranean and Pontic seas, there was only one avenue by which, when the climate was mitigated finally, it could be preoccupied by that sequence of plants and animals which it exhibits now. I'm just looking at this again. As the highland was surrounded from northeast to southwest by tundra and cold steppe, while the southward and eastward its slopes were washed by the Mediterranean and Pontic seas, there was only one avenue by which the climate was mitigated finally. It could be reoccupied by that sequence of plants. Oh, I thought I missed the reason, but they're about to name it. This avenue is from southeast and consists of a long Asiatic continuation of the highland zone itself. For the Hellespont River, as Greek geography rightly named it, offered no real obstacle, and the occurrence of alpine flora in Crete, and even in the larger Cyclades, illustrates the regional continuity between highland shores of the archipelago itself. We have therefore to conceive the highland zone as a single great region, peninsular and self-contained, thrust westward into the heart of Europe from its Armenian summit, where it joins base to base its twin eastward promontories, the North Persian ridges, and the Zagros escarpments southeastward, and the diminutive but vitally important southward causeway through Syria into South Palestine. North of the Armenian mountain knot, and intimately associated with it in climate, flora, and fauna, lay the transverse ridge of the Caucasus, steep-fronted towards Sarmatian seas, or their flatland bed. Though we have no direct evidence yet as to the older human population, the modern inhabitants of this highland zone give an important clue, and the known course of events in the long Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. Chalcolithic. Number one, I'm wondering if I'm pronouncing that right, but number two, what is it? Chalcolithic. Oh, and well, according to the pronunciation, it's Chalcolithic. Of or relating to the periods characterized by the use of both stone and bronze implements. Okay. Chalcolithic. Let's see. Now I've lost my place. Chalcolithic periods confirm that clue impressively. From end to end, the dominant type of historic times and distinct and characteristic interrelated by well-marked broad-headedness and high-headedness by wide and high orbits, set level or drooping outwards with almost no trace of brow ridges, by broad cheekbones and palate, by a characteristic wide square jaw with its hinge ends long, massive, and rising nearly at right angles with the plane of the teeth. It has broad shoulders and hips, broad hands and feet, with thick wrists and ankles, and a generally thickest build, dense parchment-like skin, sallow in the shade, and leathery under the weather. Sallow. What is sallow? Let's see. Sallow skin. Sallow. An unhealthy complexion, yellow or pale brown color. So what was sallow again? It had broad shoulders and hips, broad hands and feet with thick wrists and ankles, and a generally thickest build, dense parchment-like skin, sallow in the shade, so it looked sick and brown in the shade, and leathery under the weather. Eyes hazel or brown, dark brown, wavy hair. How would they know the eye colors if this is 100 years ago that they're talking about this? How would they get that information? Long in both sexes and very copious on the body, with profuse beard in men. Its nearest affinities are with the other white-skinned and wavy-haired types, and with these it has formed numerous intermediate varieties, within which its own bodily features appear to be, in the Mendelian sense, dominant, so that once introduced into a region, it tends to persist and become accentuated with time. So when they went into regions, their characteristics took over the other populations if they mixed. Its purer varieties are all found within the highland zone. Its occurrences in northwest Africa, Spain, and the Canaries are not sufficient to establish a southwestern origin formally proposed. The broad-headed strains, which connect its northeastward with the Mongoloid population of the Eurasiatic woodland, whose other physical features are very different, may be attributed rather to admixture between independent types spreading in opposite directions than any propagation of such strains into the highland. The alpine type, in fact, may be regarded as essentially of alpine origin. On account of its great width, this type of skull was long classed with the Mongolian, but the general build and lofty proportions of the brain case, and still more the peculiarities of the face and jaw, should have precluded this, and the absence of skin pigment, the wavy hair, and the copious beard and body hair forced the conclusion that we are dealing with a stock of quite other origin, more likely to be akin to the other white races, but nevertheless strongly contrasted with these in its head form and bodily build. Moreover, between the highland home of alpine man and the still loftier plateau, which have been seen reason to regard as the Mongoloid cradle, the narrow but gigantic ridges of the Hindu Kush and Pamirs have been long and almost continuously glaciated. As we have already noticed, their flanks are dissected by ancient transverse gorges, and below ice level there is a vast extent of dense, inhospitable forest, fed, like the snows above them, by wet monsoon winds. Such human elements as have worked their way round this vast ice cap since its last contraction have moved wholly from west to east. not from the Mongolian habitat into the Alpine and the Mongol admixture into the highlands west of the Hindu Kush, can always be traced to another and quite recent origin, namely to nomad pastorals intruded transversely from the low-lying grasslands of Turkestan, which in all but the latest phases of the Sarmatian Sea lay submerged and therefore as impassable as the snow cap. Enough seems to be known of the correlation between diet and form of the jaw, and of the pull of the jaw muscles on the temporal and parietal region of the skull to warrant the suggestion that the peculiar combination of a short and massive jaw suited rather for crushing than for cutting or tearing, with its musculature so feeble as to be accompanied by almost no lateral compression of the brain case, points to a long-continued mode of subsistence quite different from that of the carnivorous hunters of the steppes and parklands of Eurafrica. So these, I guess they're describing Neanderthals, were mainly vegetarian. They didn't eat very much meat like other humanoids. And we've already seen that the highland zone has necessarily been, at all periods, more or less completely a forest area, ill adapted to maintain the large land animals of the parkland, except quite locally and sporadically, but abounding in many kinds of trees and shrubs, bearing fruits or nuts, from conifers to chestnut and walnut, from cranberry to crabapple and sloe. The characteristic fleshy fruited apricot and peach of Persia and Armenia, and the vine, mulberry, fig, and olive, which are common to the foothills of the forest zone and the evergreen flora of the Mediterranean region south of it. We shall see reason also to suspect that the first domesticated grasses, wheat, barley, and millet, belong to the genera which inhabit this same marginal belt between the forest and the southern grasslands, and that they were cultivated by men of alpine stock as far west as the Swiss lake basins, and as early as we have any evidence of modern man in that section of the highland. In this connection, it is perhaps worth noting that Greek ethnology, which so often formulates conclusions which it has been reserved to modern observers to substantiate, clearly distinguished between an earlier phase of subsistence and that of nut-eating men. And then there's some writing in Greek. And a later meal-eating culture, and again they have the name in Greek, and that, in a very ancient stratum of Greek myth and ritual, the power to whom the gift of grain food was ascribed was worshipped with sacrifice of the pig, a typical forest ranger. But within the highland itself, the alpine type varies, and the actual distribution of its principal varieties gives a clue to its probable cradle land. Most accentuated is the Armenoid variety of the Ararat mountain region, with a head characterized by very lofty vault and outwardly drooping orbits, and so abruptly flattened behind that it has been ascribed by some observers, both ancient and modern, to artificial deformation. So these skulls that they found in this Armenoid region, they are so different that they, if I'm understanding this correctly, that they think that they are deformed. This variety predominates throughout the central section of the highland and is also not uncommon throughout the southeastern and east central Europe, least peculiar in the two respects already noted and distinguished rather by its smoothly globular cranium and by a jaw broad but not so angular, are the West European variety especially in Auvergne and Savoy, and the most easterly groups from North Persia to the Pamirs and beyond. And the general likeness between these remotest groups is in fact such as to suggest that they represent a quite early phase, both of differentiation and of outward spread. Intermediate types, characteristic of East Central and Southeastern Europe, and commonly described as Dinaric. I wonder if we can find a picture of Dinaric. Let's see. Because I'm curious to see Dinaric man. Oh, well, actually, it seems like it's an ethnicity now. Dinaric men's costume. Dalmatia, Croatia. Okay, what if we say early Dinaric man? Well, they just show 19th century pictures of people from that region. I wonder, maybe they don't use that term anymore, Dinaric. Show this globular head becoming more angular and cubical, and have their counterpart in the Caucasus, Western Persia, along the southern margin of the highland, thence towards the Dinaric area, which I guess is the Balkan Peninsula around that area. Westward, with the notable offshoots southwards to Syria. Their distribution suggests a later stage both of specialization and dissemination around the central area already described, where alone the development has attained to that extreme Armenoid phase whose distribution is least wide and also apparently least early. The relative antiquity of these successive phases of growth and spread can be stated approximately for the outermost western Sevenol type made its appearance in the Alps and in France during the transition from the late Paleolithic to Neolithic cultures at Offnet in Bavaria. It made its appearance in the Azilian phase, mixed with Aurignacian people, and already interbreeding with them eastward. On the other hand, the human remains of the Anau show no such alpine type had reached the north margin of Persia until the second desertion of the early settlement. Similarly, the broadhead intruders into Egypt at the beginning of the dynastic series and into Crete in the Cyclades at the beginning of the Minoan Bronze Age belong to the second phase, which may therefore be dated about 4000 to 3500 BC, and the first known occupants of Cyprus and of Troy, and the earliest Bronze Age, are of the same type. Fully developed Armenoid remains, on the other hand, do not seem to be found anywhere until the second millennium at earliest. At present, therefore, it seems safe to regard this alpine group of broad-headed types as representing phases of a special development within the Armenian mountain mass, or rather, since this region was certainly subjected to severe glaciation during the Ice Age, within the mountain-girt plateau of Asia Minor, immediately west of it, large enough isolated enough, and at all relevant periods habitable enough to become the cradle of such a sequence of varieties, sufficiently well connected with large similarly qualified regions eastward and westward, and sufficiently liable from its geographical position to periodic changes of climate to serve as a reservoir of population, like the highlands of Atlas and the Iberian Peninsula in the earlier times, and like the Arabian and Eurasian reservoirs later on. Surprise has sometimes been expressed that even considering how little scientific research there has been in the region, traces of Paleolithic culture are still rare here, especially in view of the quite common occurrence of Neolithic implements of polished stone in all parts of it. There is, however, good reason why flaked implements should be, in any case, rare in such a region. Though fairly well adapted for attacking wild animals, cutting up game, and dressing hides, and even for shaping and decorating implements of bone and antler, the flaked implement is comparatively ineffective for felling trees, splitting logs, dressing planks, or pounding roots, bark, or nuts. Moreover, though a large part of the Great Flatlands consist of or rest on flint-bearing strata, Cretaceous or derivative, and are as open country as they actually are, mainly because these limestone surfaces are inhospitable to trees. And in the highland zone, on the other hand, these beds are either absent, which accentuates its forest aspect, seeing how precarious is tree growth over limestone, or so distorted or even deficient in flint and chert. What is chert? I'm going to look up chert. It's probably some kind of stone, right? Let's see. Chert. Yeah, chert is a sedimentary rock. It looks like chalk almost. It kind of looks chalky. Let me bring up a picture of chert. Well, that looks chalky, but the other ones don't. These are almost crystal-like. Whoops. Okay, let's go back. Where's chert? Flint and chert, that the supply of this material was scanty. And what was worse, discontinuous collateral evidence is that in Egypt, where the timber was so rare and exotic, the flake technique persisted and underwent cumulative refinement from Sultrian and Chalcolithic times. And that in the kitchen middens, I remember that word from last time, kitchen middens, that's like the waste, the piles of waste from the food, like the food dumps of Northwest Europe, acquaintance with polished implements increases pari passu. What does that mean? Pari passu. Let's see. Oh. Let's see. Pari passu. Side by side, at the same rate or on equal footing. So side by side. Let's see, how are they using it here? Europe acquaintance with polished implements increases pari passu with the northward advance of oak forest. So you always see these implements, these Chalcolithic. Wait, we have to go back. The flake technique persisted and underwent cumulative refinement from Solutrean and to Chalcolithic times. In the in-kitchen middens of Northeast Europe, acquaintance with polished implements increases pari passu with the northward advance of oak forest. So as the oak forest advances, you also see this pairing of the more polished tools, more refined tools. Just as these and the dwarf birch had previously invaded the cold steppe. A further point that even before acquaintance with the polished technique began, there is a complete revolution in the mode of employment of stone implements generally. The tapering pyramidal point for stabbing and the longitudinal edge for cutting or ripping are supplemented and eventually replaced with more massive implements, by the transverse edge for hacking and clearing under shock rather than pressure applied to the butt end. This is conspicuous in the Campanian technique, which will be remembered as marking the last Paleolithic aggression in the moist, forest-ridden West. The form of the butt end, too, frequently suggests the use of some form of haft. What is that? Haft. Haft. Let's see. Haft is the handle of a knife or an axe or a spear. Provide a blade, axe head, or spear head with a haft. Okay. Well, let's see. How are they using it here? The form of the butt end, too, frequently suggests the use of some form of haft. Okay, so they have the blade, they find the blades, but maybe not the handle. But the way the blade or the impact part is designed, it seems to suggest that there was some type of handle there at some point. And hafting itself presumes familiarity with wooden staves and clubs, and therefore with parkland at all events. So the very fact that they're making handles implies that they were living near trees. Again, in any region where roots and tubers formed any considerable part of the food supply, the mere act of breaking the ground with a pick or a hoe, whether of wood or bone or antler or of hafted stone, automatically smooths the surface of the implement about the point or the edge, and leads to a natural finish familiar among the digging hoes of shell, which are used by some Pacific peoples, and among Stone Age hoes of pre-Columbian sites in North America. Let me recenter this. For this, it is but a single step to the artificial improvement of blunted or splintered edges by grinding, not by flaking. And certain implements from the Nile Valley show every stage of this advance in technique. Though they are always exceptional there and late on these grounds, the inference seems justified that whatever other causes may have been in operation, forest life, and especially the hacking of the timber and the grubbing up of edible roots, favored the development of such type of stone implements, and methods of manufacture actually occur earliest and most persistently throughout the highland zone, and are the least and latest represented in the comparatively treeless regions such as the Nile Valley and the wide flatland of North Africa. It would be premature to correlate in more than most attentive way the polished stone technique exhibited in this region, both by cutting, cleaving, and grubbing implements, and by those for crushing and rubbing which so commonly accompany them, with the probability already noted that the type of skull and jaw characteristic of alpine man may result from long habituation to a diet of nuts, roots, and other vegetable foodstuffs, needing steady mastication rather than biting and tearing which meat requires, and so thoroughly received from a long, highly musculated jaw and prominent incisors and canines, both of Negro man and the long-skulled Orinacean hunters of Eurafrica and the Northwest, but the coincidence is noteworthy, and the roughly concomitant spread of Neolithic culture and the alpine types of man is more striking still. That the earlier stages of such spread should be ill represented is only what might be expected in view of the prolonged glaciation and widespread of diluvial deposits of those western sections of the highland zone, which alone are adequately explored. But it seems clear that the advanced stage of Neolithic industry which is represented even in the earliest settlements around the Swiss and Italian lakes, which had an alpine population, presupposes a long and homogeneous development and the occasional introduction of implements in fairly advanced phases of this polished technique into the Danish kitchen middens, which are the leavings of the Aurignacian people among a multitude of flaked implements of the Campanian and other late Paleolithic makes, suggests that in northwestern Europe, at all events, there was just such an overlap of the older and newer industries, as is proved, for the long-headed and broad-headed stocks themselves, by the mixed Azelian deposit at Offnet in Bavaria, which is of sufficiently late date. Okay, now we have a map here. What are they showing us? Okay, so they're showing us the very black is tundra and alpine treeless areas. So that's Norway, Sweden, Finland. The coniferous forest. So coniferous trees are cone trees like evergreens. And that would be around, where is that? That's like Denmark and Finland and various parts of, or little parts of Great Britain and, oh wait, it's easier if I look at the big map. And then we've got the evergreen trees, which seem to cover, where do they cover? Oh, we've got the deciduous broad-leaved trees and forests, which seem to be most of Europe, France and Germany. And then the evergreens, where do we see evergreens? Well, that seems to be most of Spain and North Africa. Okay, and then we have the temperate grasslands, which seem to be far eastern Europe. Semi-desert. Where's the semi-desert? And that's not surprisingly the Sahara already. Okay, and then we've got this other map. Olive vine and orange areas of the Mediterranean. So olives are horizontal lines. Most of Spain and Italy and Greece. Vines are France and Germany and Poland. And oranges, and it's kind of hard to tell, but Portugal, Greece, Sicily. Okay. I have to recenter this. Somehow it gets off center when you change pages. Okay. Invite comparison to the earliest broad-headed remains from Grenelle near Paris and Ferfous in eastern Belgium, and with the earliest lake dwellers among the Alps themselves. Part 2. Characteristics of Neolithic culture. Formerly, when attention was still mainly directed to the various types of stone implements found accidentally in surface soil, the contrast between flaked and polished technique seemed to be of greater value as an indication of date than now, when the long overlap in time of these two techniques has been established on evidence from tombs and stratified sites, and when the significance of each fabric is better understood, though the terms Paleolithic and Neolithic have remained in common use for the older and later phases of the Stone Age, They are now applied in a secondary sense to denote strongly contrasted phases of general advancement. And it's important to realize wherein this contrast consists. The men of the older Stone Ages took the world as they found it. They made little attempt to alter it. They chipped natural stones into weapons for cutting and stabbing. They wrapped themselves in skins and furs stripped from their prey. But the animals which they hunted and the fruits which they gathered were wild. Their shelters were natural caves. They buried their dead, at best, in a hole in the cave floor. With the late exception of hafted spears, they had no notion of construction. And they had no use for timber, or for any movable object not easily held in the hand. The sole hints of cooperation or of social order are occasional whistles and carved staves, which may have symbolized rank. We may probably fill in the picture from the habits of merely hunting peoples on the open lands of Siberia. North and South America, South Africa, and Australia, except insofar as all of these have acquired the dog, which cannot be traced back earlier than the kitchen middens. The New Stone Age, from its first beginnings, reveals a quite different outlook on nature. Even the implements illustrate this. Their materials are varied and presume search and selection, methodical and gradual improvement, constructed skill in hafting, and the appreciation of the elastic quality of wood for long axe helves, and above all for the bow, which appears first in the transitional rock paintings of Spain, with an axe and adze. Man's dominion over the forest was assured. Okay, wait a minute. So let's see if we can find, what did they call this? Transitional rock paintings in Spain. Let's see if we can find a picture of that. Transitional rock paintings in Spain. Oh, well, these are pretty familiar looking. And they're pretty nice, too. They're pretty good paintings. I'll just bring one up here. You've probably seen this before. So I guess they're referring to these. You have to admit they're pretty good. I couldn't do that. I couldn't make a nice picture like that. Okay, let's go back. Now there's this funny word, adze. I want to find out what that means. So with axe and adze, let's see what an adze is. A-D-Z-E. A tool similar to an axe with an arched blade and right angles. How do you pronounce that?
Adze.
Adze. You don't pronounce the E. Okay, I'll just show you a picture of it in case you, like me, you've never seen that before. It looks like a hammer. Oh, well, some of them look like a hammer and some of them don't. That's an adze. Okay, let's see. Let's go back. With axe and adze, man's dominion over the forest was assured, and with chisel and saw, his mastery over the timber he had to fell. Loose stones he had already piled together occasionally, at all events, to conceal his dead. Okay, there was a footnote here. Let me recenter this and then try to read the footnote here. So some French observers, however, have interpreted certain linear designs in the Magdalenian caves as representing wigwams and pitfalls for game. Okay. Carpentry and roof construction were only a matter of time. To utilize other waste products of nature, fibrous twigs, grass bark, fruit rind, and the like for binding, wrapping, and eventually for platters, bags, baskets, was another elementary step in the same direction, supplementing the use, which was already ancient, of hunters' debris, bones, sinew, hide, and fur for man seems to have used up his own leavings before appropriating those of nature. The caulking of such vessels with another waste product, ubiquitous mud, led to the substitution of mere clay, hardened by fire, to earthenware for perishable skins and basketry. Other waste products, nuts, kernels, pips, grass seeds, squandered after a meal and found germinating in spoiled earth round old encampments, propounded problems of their own. It has been suggested, too, that early beliefs connecting such germination with human life and death may have been suggested by unforeseen growth of fresh plants over old graves. But this obviously did not occur till the graves were in the open and not in cave floors, and the whole notion that by deranging natural soil, natural vegetation may be supplanted by a crop more edible and fertile, and of man's own selection, is quite outside the hunter's range of ideas. The other new notion of captivating rather than capturing wild creatures and making them domestic, that is, at home around the camp, is less alien to the hunter's thought and in simpler forms is not easily reconcilable with the plans of the plant grower. Between Cain and Abel in the story, there was an early feud, for the grazing herd draws no distinction between the natural and cultivated green stuff, except to prefer the latter. But fundamentally, the pastoral creed is the same as that of cultivators. Man's place is in nature, is at the source of life, and to multiply and replenish the earth. These various forms of exploitation increase subsistence, but they demand effort. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. When the world is so full of a number of things as it becomes for either cultivator or pastoral, a human group is so far released from the rigorous restrictions of self-imposed on hunting hordes that it may increase its population not merely safely, but with advantage. Many hands make light work, but many hands, many herds, and much more of foods which must be gathered at one harvest. For the 12th month mean much fear of attack from without. And other waste products, loose stones, dead trees, mere soil, were piled into a ring fence around the settlement. It was only gradually that unpenetrable defenses challenged invention. So it sounds like they're saying the garbage heaps of the waste that they created were like the first fences or defenses of the, I guess, what you would call the village. Let me recenter this. Every time I change the page, it becomes uncentered. Okay. These principal aspects of invention, which is reason's adjustment of the materials and the forces of nature to fulfill desires, all come into view as the new Stone Age dawns and separate it from the old. Of the other great inventions, we have to wait long even for the next, when fire, already in use to harden clay, should be applied also to soften stone and to extract metals therefrom. And when animals already tame should yield man not only nutriment, but a new source of power. For others, on a higher intellectual plane, come only slowly into sight. Observation of the sun and moon in their seasons, first hinted by sundry circles and crescents in Neolithic art, superseding the Paleolithic masterpieces of animal portraiture. The curiously abstract quality of much else in Neolithic ornament, as if a number, mass, and proportion were felt to have an interest of their own, a conception of value, which may fairly be presumed among people who, though sedentary, are found to have acquired, for whatever reason, commodities from afar, like turquoise or amber, and a new self-consciousness and introspection displayed an emphasis on details of technique in decoration and in the choice of men and their acts and works rather than natural forms for pictorial record. Still higher aspects of advancement than these are even less easy to detect without risk of private interpretation. Whatever the first purpose of those emphatically feminine figures whose Neolithic types eventually come to be associated with the profoundest conceptions of early religion, their origin is not here, but long before in the Aurignacian time. The same applies to the first impulse to representative art of other kinds, and any magical implications which it may have had, in which Magdalenian draftsmen are unexcelled. To the motives for careful disposal of the dead, which as a custom is at least Mousterian, and to the beliefs and emotions aroused by the primeval mystery of fire, all these we may take to have already traditional at the close of the Old Stone Age. The new added only those fresh glimpses of the significance of life, which were suggested by experimental acquaintances with the behavior of animals and plants, religious conceptions such as those of a God shepherd, or of the bread of life, can hardly have anticipated economic discoveries from which they draw their symbolism, while they may be but little subsequent. In estimating the significance of forest and dense parkland as a factor in the transition of the Neolithic stage, the distribution of such conditions should be considered as a whole, the composition of actual forests in Europe. Shows them to have resulted from spread across and coalescence around the least three centers. The clearest example of this is in the northeast, where the characteristic birches, pines, and oaks of the Alpine highland, spreading beyond the foothills of the Carpathians over central Russia, have met about longitude 45 degrees, a westward spreading woodland composed of Siberian species. That their narrow zone interpenetration, once established by contact of their advancing margins, has remained in long equilibrium is shown by the distribution of early cultures and varieties of man, all eastward of this zone, being related to the widespread Asiatic types, and nearly all west of it Alpine, Danubian, and Baltic. Only comparatively recently have Asiatic peoples succeeded in establishing themselves west of this zone and acquiring unfamiliar woodcraft. To the southwest of the course of events that has not been so clearly traced, the greater range of latitude here and the wider variations of climate which the Atlantic seaboard has undergone have permitted far greater oscillation. The woodlands of Spain and Africa Minor have been repeatedly continuous with those of West Central Europe and have developed but few distinctive forms, so that their coalescence is harder to detect. The former existence of large forest regions between the Pyrenees and the Sahara is, however, established. The Spanish forest flora stands more closely related to North African than to Alpine. But Deep interpenetration is shown on the one hand by the Spanish chestnut and walnut, which intrude from the alpine highland, and on the other by the occurrence of evanescent Lusitanian types as far as the British Isles. That the latest interpenetration was but recent is demonstrated by the comparatively narrow range of typically alpine forms beyond the Garonne, and especially by the fact that some of the most important of them, like the chestnut and walnut, are notably serviceable to man. All considerations therefore drawn from the peculiarities of the forest life, such as the Neolithic skill to grind implements instead of chipping, and the exploitation of nuts and other tree fruits for food, apply in a measure to a forested highlands beyond the Garonne, and as well as to those of Central and Southeastern Europe. In the same way, arguments based on the early development of agriculture along the southeastern margins of the highland towards Mesopotamia and Syria, or in the Nile Valley, apply also to the foothills of the Atlas and Pyrenees, to the margins of the Iberian tableland, and to other well-watered coastlands of the western Mediterranean. An account must be taken of ancient and persistent tradition that cereals were introduced into Greece by a Sicilian goddess, and that wheat and barley grew wild in the lands of the Western Sea. Similarly, the domestication of animals, though certainly very early in Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia, cannot be assumed to be necessarily derived from these regions. On the one side, the breeds of domestic animals at Anau, in the foothills between Transcaucasia and Iran, and the early settlements along its western parkland fringe are distinct from those of the ancient East. On the other, those of Western Europe differing from both these groups and no less from those of the Alpine Lakeland may be independent and Eurafrican. Most significant of all, whereas the earliest pottery of the ancient East mainly copies the forms of gourd vessels appropriate to a region of large, irrigable alluvia, traversing ill-watered and inhospitable flatland, those of Western Mediterranean and of the whole Atlantic seaboard exhibit intimate dependence on fine basketry, such as still supplements pottery for storage purposes throughout the Atlas region and Iberia. In fact, wherever the characteristic esparto grass dominates all open country and furnishes unsurpassed material for this kind of gear, the Nile Valley, lying towards the western edge of the Esparto region, participates in both techniques. And the earliest graves pottery of indigenous stoneware models is associated both with the swollen, unornamented gourd forms and polished redware, and with dull brown or black plates and saucers, quite different in profile and copiously incised, with angular geometrical schemes as closely reminiscent of basketry as the shapes of the vessels themselves. Okay, I have to take a minute break and get something to drink. I'll be right back. All right, we're back. Oh, let's keep going here. What have we got? That this kind of evidence should come into reckoning at all is a measure of the gulf which separates the study of Old Stone Age from the New. And attention must be drawn at this point to the fresh source of information as to human habits and activities, which is derived from objects of baked clay. During Paleolithic times, almost the only evidence for man's mode of life is supplied by his implements of stone, and latterly of bone and antler. And for his artistic capacity by the carved decoration of these, and by the engraved and painted walls of his cavern homes. Henceforward, though, the successive types of implements remain of very great importance. Their evidence is supplemented almost everywhere by that of pottery, more varied and far more expressive. There are special reasons for this eloquence of potsherds. First, clay is eminently plastic, unlike stone, wood, or fiber. It has no grain or texture of its own. It is therefore fictile. Let me recenter this. Fictile. I'm going to look that up. I mean, I guess I know what it means through the context, but I just want to... I would just feel better if I look up the definition of fictile. Let's see. Fictile. Made of earth or clay by a potter, relating to pottery or its manufacture, capable of being molded, plastic. So moldable. Fictile is like moldable. All objects of pottery are therefore literally figments of the potter's will, fictions, to vary the phrase, of his memory or imagination. Hath not the potter power over the clay, but the potter, and still more those who will use his pots, are creatures of habit. A hunting or a pastoral people, if it makes pottery at all, will make its clay vessels like hunters' game bags, or the leathern bowls and flasks of the nomad dairy, or forest folk, will imitate wooden bowls or basketry. Agriculturalists, straw plate or gourds. Moreover, the practice of primitive peoples suggests that sometimes pottery has originated accidentally through leaky vessels of other materials temporarily caulked with clay and being dropped into a fire. For plastic as it is to begin with, clay once fired is unalterable, whereas many materials which it is used to replace are perishable. It may even, in the case supposed, not merely retain the form of the basket of which it was the lining, but even the impress of the basket work. Examples of such impressions on early and primitive pottery are worldwide and serve to record whole industries whose actual products have disappeared. But, however indestructible in detail, pottery is so fragile as to be particularly irreparable once broken. Consequently, there is enormous waste, as every housekeeper knows, and accumulation of discarded fragments. It provides, therefore, exceptionally copious material, and as every fragment is an original work of art, the evidence of pottery justifies broader and surer generalizations than almost any other human document. every potsherd and any waste heap being the response of somebody's hand and brain to somebody's need, at the same time individual and communal, industrial, and aesthetic. A further consequence of this fragility is that pottery is seldom carried far from place of manufacture. Its presence characterizes a settled mode of life and signals the neighborhood of a settlement. Though, on the other hand, the absence of pottery from any district is no proof of the non-existence of a nomad population, the utter uselessness of pottery, once broken except as extemporized scrapers, or as builders' ballasts to level a new floor, is the main cause of its archaeological value. For where broken pottery is cast out of a settlement, there it is allowed to lie and accumulate, layer over layer, later over earlier, so that the sequence dating derived from such a rubbish heap is as secure as the sequence of fossils in the sedimentary rocks, and of the highest value as evidence for changes in style, that is to say, of the notions of industrial and aesthetic of successive generations of makers and breakers of pottery. As breakage and replacement are constant, clay almost ubiquitous, and pot transport risky, the pottery series in any settlement is exceptionally continuous and coherent. The smallest changes of style are recorded infallibly, directly, and immediately, and every other object cast upon the same waste heap is conserved automatically in stratified order, and can be dated by the potsherds around it, between older ones below and later ones above. Further, being ubiquitous and plastic, clay is also cheap. It is the poor man's substitute for materials which he cannot afford. It may therefore record not only the equipment of daily life, but the fashionable shapes of articles of luxury, such as vessels of gold and silver. It is also the mean man's subterfuge on occasions of customary sacrifice to equip the dead. For example, with a cheap and durable imitation of valuable originals, retained for the use of survivors. This is the special interest of all funerary pottery, for it correlates each isolated tomb group with the waste heaps of the settlement to which it belongs. In general, therefore, the potsherds of any people record continuously and accurately. Oh, let me do that again. In general, therefore, the potsherds of any people record continuously and accurately the general culture and style of successive periods, the local and daily variations both of needs and of the satisfaction of them, the more abrupt innovations resulting from intercourse with neighbors similarly recorded, and the revolutions due to immigration. Conquest in particular may leave its memorial in wholesale destruction and clearance of the debris of war, and in collateral production afterwards of objects in distinct fashions, peasant style and palace style, for the respective use of old compatriots and new masters. And as it usually happens in simple societies that pot making is women's work, suppression of an indigenous by an immigrant style is strong presumption that the newcomers brought their own women with them, whereas if they intermarried with natives, there may be perplexing combinations, for example, of indigenous shapes and technique with imported ornaments, to please the master's eye. In either case, eventual coalescence of racial or social elements may be signaled by the rise of a new mixed style, which is sometimes of striking originality. Part 3. Regional types of Neolithic culture, Alpine Europe. We have seen that the first indication of westward spread of a new variety of man is the appearance of broad-headed individuals, side by side with Aurignacian longheads, in a remarkable burial place in the Azilian cave at Offnet in Bavaria, and in caves at Logerie-Basse and elsewhere in central France. Isolated examples in several districts in Spain of uncertain and probably rather later age may indicate that the spread of forest conditions had carried the same human movement far to the southwest, but allowance has to be made here for the effects of a later seaborne movement, which will be discussed in its place below. Next, and far more significant because associated with fresh elements of culture, is the broad-headed population of the pile dwellings which occupy all of the principal alpine lakes. Here, organized communities were occupying settlements on artificially constructed platforms, supported by wooden piles, driven into the lake bottom, and communicating with the bottom, both by hunting and fishing and by collecting wild fruits and nuts from the forest. Oh, wait a minute, I skipped a line here. And communicated with the shore by a gangway. These communities maintain themselves both by hunting and fishing and by collecting wild fruits and nuts from the forest. But they also practiced agriculture from the first, and must therefore have brought this art with them when they first ventured into lake land. Their wheat, barley, millet, and flax are of the same species and varieties that were cultivated in the earliest known settlements on the Nile alluvium. And in the earliest stratum of Anau, oats and rye, on the other hand, they did not grow, though wild plants have wide range in Europe. Perhaps they gathered them while wild, as people still gather them for food in outlying villages of Germany. But, if so, it is odd that no grains of them fell overboard. Domesticated animals only became known here later. And this again corresponds with the sequence of events at Anau. Their implements include harpoons, perforators, and scrapers of bone and deer antler, perpetuating Magdalenian and Azilian forms, flaked flints like those of Azil and Tardenoise, and especially many miniature flakes, one use of which is here demonstrated by their occurrence mounted lengthways, like new teeth in wooden hafts. Early Egyptian reapers used sickles of the same construction, but along with these are numerous implements formed from natural pebbles of compact stone, selected for oval or cylindrical form, and improved either by splitting them longitudinally or by grinding a natural wedge-shaped end on one or both of its faces to form a cutting edge. In these tough or granular materials, flaking is almost impracticable. Similar pebble-shaped implements with ground and polished edge are found in many regions, in surface soil and other post-glacial deposits, and mark the beginning of the new Stone Age, wherever they occur. Gradually, the grinding and polishing were applied to the whole surface of such implements to improve their symmetry. I just wonder if I'm just curious to see what new Stone Age tools look like. New Stone Age tools. To see how different they are. Oh yeah, they're much nicer. they're beautiful compared to the old Stone Age. Let me just bring up a picture here. So if you compare those to the old Stone Age tools, they're very obviously tools, polished, and they look very beautiful, relatively speaking. Let's see. Early Egyptian reapers used sickles of the same construction, but along with these are numerous implements formed from natural pebbles of compact stone, selected for oval or cylindrical form, and improved either by splitting them longitudinally or by grinding a naturally shaped end on one or both of its faces to form a cutting edge. In these tough or granular materials, flaking is almost impracticable. Similar pebble-shaped implements with ground and polished edge are found in many regions, in surface soil and other post-glacial deposits, and mark the beginning of the new Stone Age wherever they occur. Gradually, the grinding and polishing were applied to the whole surface of such implements, to improve their symmetry. But it was long before oval or tapering pebble-shaped shape at the butt end was replaced by flat sides, and more or less rectilinear profile. Flat edges, in particular, are a mark of advanced technique and comparatively late date. Another important innovation is the perforating of hammer stones and eventually of hammer axes, effected first with sand and a blunt stick, later with a tubular drill of reed. A similar drill was used along the reed-fringed Nile at the early pre-dynastic stage. The frequent fires to which the pile dwellings were liable must have familiarized their occupants with the effects of fire on clay, even if they had not this knowledge already. And their pottery, which is found even on the earliest sites, is so primitive that it may well be original. Much of it is clumsy and formless. But the more shapely pots take their forms almost exclusively from leather vessels. At first, there's no attempt at ornament. Later, mottled rims and ridges and roughly scratched patterns betray the influence of basketry and textiles, first of the local and later also of the non-alpine styles from the Rhine and Danube vases. Let's see, New Stone Age pottery. Let's see if they have any pictures of this easily viewable. Well, it's pretty good. Let's see. Here are some examples of New Stone Age pottery, and they do have some decorations on them. Not bad. Here's an artist's depiction. Someone making New Stone Age pottery. Does this have the... No, this is decoration. I was wondering if that had like the basket shape. Okay, let's go back. The earliest lake dwellers buried their dead ashore in earth graves or slab-lined cists. But at a quite early stage, it became customary to burn the bodies and bury the ashes with such personal ornaments as endured the fire, in a rough clay pot closed with a saucer. As this custom of cremation destroyed direct evidence from skeletons, it prevents positive conclusions as to later changes of race. But by drowning and other accidents, enough individuals escaped a regular funeral to justify not merely the view that the population of the lake regions remained broad-headed throughout, as it still essentially is, but the hypothesis that in most early periods people who burned their dead were probably of broad-headed ancestry. Later exceptions will be noted and discussed as they occur. The sudden and widespread establishment of the lake-dwelling culture and of the broad-headed type almost explains itself. From its very construction, a lake village could not be expanded indefinitely, and consequently, if its home population outgrew, superfluous members had to go elsewhere and construct a fresh one. And as the alpine lake basins are interconnected, both downstream and by the passes between the valley heads, what may be described as the longitudinal propagation was easy, both within the highland and along the rivers which issue from it. And in fact, such movements have been traced into the Danube Valley and beyond it, into the rivers of the North German plain and the peat mosses of the Danish peninsula, along the whole course of the Rhine and widely over northern France, Belgium, and Britain, where lake villages were numerous, especially in mosses and bogs in Scotland. In Scotland and Ireland. Some of them remained in use until Roman times, as at Glastonbury, and even later still changing their industries, arts, but not their structure or organization. On the steep southern face of the Alps, the abrupt transition from highland to alluvial plain checked such expansion for long. But towards the end of the Stone Age, a sudden movement spread lake dwellings from Lakes Como and Maggiore as far as the main channel of the Po. A little later, when bronze was already in occasional use, a similar but more vigorous emigration from the eastern Alps occupied all over the lower valley, crossed the main river, and advanced in the specialized stream bed settlements known as terra mar. From the use made of their debris as a fertilizer by the modern peasants. As far as the passes of the Apennines, a few adventurous parties passed into Lower Italy, and one such settlement exists close to Taranto. Reserving the details of this profoundly important movement from the chapter of Prehistoric Italy in Volume 2. It must be noted here that by bursting the triple barrier of the Alps, fenland, and Apennine forest, which had hitherto secluded Italy, this migration of lake dwellers established a continuity of race and of culture between the peninsula and the tributaries of the middle and upper Danube, which has had profound influence throughout all later ages. And it is a commonplace that the history of this peninsula is that of Italy and its invaders. And the first of these invaders are the Alpine lake folk and their descendants in the terra mare villages. Eastward, subsequent changes have been so numerous and far-reaching that equivalents of those alpine lake dwellings are not easily found. Quite early examples occur as far east as Laibach. Later settlements, widely unsuitable sites throughout the Hungarian lowland and the influence of their culture, extends as far north as Bohemia. In Bosnia, the remarkable settlement at Butmir and less famous sites in the same region illustrate special adaptation of the pile structure to dry valley bottoms. I'm just curious, if I type Bosnia Butmir, what comes up? Bosnia Butmir. Do they show pictures of something? Oh yeah, that's not a very good picture, but they show like a prehistoric village. Let me bring that up. So maybe they reconstructed this prehistoric village. Where do we stop? Eastward, subsequent changes have been so numerous and far-reaching that equivalents of these alpine lake dwellings are not easily found. Quite early examples occur as far east as Laibach. Later settlements widely on suitable sites throughout the Hungarian lowland, and the influence of their culture extends as far north as Bohemia. In Bosnia, the remarkable settlement that is at Butmir, and the less famous sites in that same region illustrate special adaptation of the pile structure to dry valley bottoms. In many ways analogous to Italian terra mare, Herodotus in the 5th century BC graphically describes the pile dwellings of Lake Prasius in the Strymon Basin, and the occurrence of pottery of typical lacustrine and terra mare forms in the part of Macedonia and elsewhere in the Balkans confirms and amplifies his testimony. It kind of reminds me of Atlantis. If you see maps of Atlantis, it's circular and it's surrounded by water. It's kind of interesting. Further afield again, ancient descriptions of pile dwellings in waterlogged valleys of North Syria and Georgia, unverified as yet by excavation, suggest that our lake settlements are to be regarded as a westward section, a very large region of early and essentially homogeneous culture adapted to the conditions of a moist, forest-clad lakeland, such as Asia Minor. And much of the highland region eastward of it must have constituted during the long pluvial period, which was the counterpart of the Ice Age in Europe. The same climatic changes which have restricted the forests and displaced northwestward the forest fauna and forest type of man have not only disrupted this area of culture, but have also destroyed much of the evidence of its former extent. For the torrential discharge of the modern seasonal rainfall has scoured out most of the alluvium from the valleys, leaving only the numerous early types of polished implements in which this whole region abounds, though it is apparently devoid of chipped flints, to testify to the former existence of such a culture. The actual area of continuous lake-dwelling culture has thus been very much reduced by adverse physical changes, aggressive from the southeast. It has also been superseded both on this side and around the margins of its alpine citadel by the other types of culture better accommodated to these changes, which, as we've seen in this extreme instance, have been on the whole by way of less moisture and greater warmth and consequent curtailment of lakeland and forest. Part 4. Regional Types, the Danube Basin. The first great change indeed affecting the lake culture itself is typical of what was going on. This is the introduction of domesticated animals. And as all these, in the alpine lake villages, are the breeds not derived from the wild species of the region, but identical with domesticated breeds of the Near East. Ancient and modern, and with some of those known in Neolithic Egypt, it may be inferred that their arrival in Central Europe results either through exchange from tribe to tribe or from southeast through a direct immigration of pastoral people possessing such flocks and herds. Both would be impracticable as long as a dense and continuous forest covered southeastern Europe, to the Carpathians and the Hellespont. Either would be comparatively easy as soon as a drier climate with a more seasonal rainfall of the Helladic and Mediterranean type began to break up the forest into parkland and meadow, a process which is always accelerated by the presence of either of porous limestones like those of the Dinaric and Balkan chains, or of the loess deposits which, as we've seen, cover so much of the lowlands of Hungary and Bulgaria, as well as Romania, Galicia, and Ukraine. Similar loess deposits occupy large areas of Moravia and Bohemia, of the upper Danube and its northern tributaries, of the Neckar, Main, and Middle Rhine. West of the last named river lay the north and south barrier of the Jura, Vosges, Ardennes, accentuated by the denser woodland which is fed by the wet winds of the Atlantic seaboard, and still clothes the western slopes and masks the passes between them. These loess lands, now I'm thinking I'm pronouncing it wrong again. Now, let me just, loess, is it loess or less? Let's see.
Less.
Less, okay, I was pronouncing it wrong. Less. Less, try to remember that. They keep using this word. These less lands had been the last prairie hunting grounds of Magdalenian and Azilian man. And the wet forest of the transition period closed up. As the wet forest of the transition period closed up along the highlands of the north from the Carpathians to the Taunus and Black Forest, when the Neolithic period opened, they were still occupied by long-headed folk, only slightly modified from the late Paleolithic Aurignacians, but distinguished from the relatives north and west of those forested highlands by a fuller oval head form, less angular and associated with other characteristics which persisted long and only gave way gradually before the later expansion of broad-headed alpine foresters. Here, with all of the conditions for the spread either of pastoral or agricultural folk, so soon as the loftier and therefore more forest-bound regions to the southeast became passable. The evidence for such passage, as for the period at which it was achieved, is, as usual, twofold, from the copious relics of the new and distinctive culture and from the physical remains of the people themselves during and after its introduction. The earliest Neolithic culture of the wide and interconnected lowlands of the Balkan lands and the headwaters of the Danube and the basins of the Neckar, Main, Upper Elbe, and Oder is curiously uniform in type. There are regular settlements in the open valleys, usually grouped in clusters within reach of a considerable stream. They combine pastoral and agricultural life and possess the same primitive crops as the alpine lake folk and the same herds as the lake folk acquired eventually. Their habitual implements are of the split and ground pebble type, but show a characteristic improvement on those of the lake folk and of the great southeastern region of the Balkan lands in Asia Minor, in that they are ground nearly flat, one on the face and only left rounded on the other. For timber working and still more for hoeing, this adze like celt, set transversely in its haft, had obvious advantages. As with careful usage, it maintained its own edge, like the shell adzes used for sago getting in Melanesia. What is a sago? Wait, let's see. Sago. I'm just going to Google sago getting. Sago getting. It's a palm tree? I mean, that's what comes up, palm trees. I don't know. Okay. The sago getting in Melanesia. And the convex mattock of the Levantine peasant. Well, what's a mattock? So many words. Mattock. A mattock is like a, well, I'll show you, it's like a pick. I'll just show you a picture of what I get. Probably everybody else knows this except me, but these are mattocks. It's like a pick. The pottery of these settlements consists mainly of small globular vessels, rather more than hemispherical, rounded below, and usually without rim or handle. There's no hint of imitation of any kind of structure, such as leather or basketry, and the outer surface, smooth and uniform, is treated as a single open field for a continuous scheme of decoration, which returns into itself and has earned for this technique the nicknames of band pottery, band ceramic, céramique au ruban, and of the free field style, the design. The designs are rendered by continuous lines, incised in the clay before firing, either rectilinear zigzags or curved into lobes, waves, or coils. Sometimes rather complicated, and always quite irrespective of any limits but those imposed by the general shape of the pot. There's no attempt to emphasize or distinguish its parts, for indeed it usually has none. At most, there may be a collar band following the edge of the opening. This is so different from the commoner skeuomorphic decoration. Skeuomorphic. What does that mean? Skeuomorphic. A skeuomorphic is a derivative object that retains ornamental design cues, attributes from structures that were necessary in the original. So like making an impression. Oh, if I try to find pictures of skeuomorph, I don't really see anything. But it sounds like something like if you put the clay in the basket and then it dries, it takes on the characteristic of the basket. The pattern. I think that's what it means. It's funny because mostly what I see are pictures of iPhones for some reason. I don't know. Okay. Skeuomorphic decoration. So maybe making impressions on the clay of an object by enhancing its natural texture or structural elements, for example, in the Western and Northwestern styles, to be described later, and so closely resemble the free field ornament employed by those modern peoples who make their vessels of gourds, whose natural surface is uniformly smooth and of imperceptible texture, that it has been suggested with much probability that the Danubian band pottery likewise originated so, and that consequently its origin must be sought further southeast in regions such as Asia Minor and Syria, where gourd plants occur naturally and have been in memorial use at the earliest post fabrics of these adjacent region attest. Here again, allowance must be made for the known shift of climate and account taken for the remarkable gourd types of the first pottery of Cyprus. and less distinctively of certain early fabrics in the Cyclades and Crete, which, like Cyprus, lie under the lee of the continental area, and also of a distinct gourd element in the Neolithic pottery of Egypt, which is not aboriginal there, but intrudes itself at an early phase among indigenous forms, mainly derived from vases of stone. Once again, it looks as though we were witnessing such an exodus from Asia Minor, both to southeast and northwest, as we have already had occasion to infer, as a probable consequence of the desiccation of a section of the highland zone. What does desiccation mean? Act or process of drying or desiccating something to a state of being or becoming dried up. So not desertification, but drying up. And as indicated by the distribution of the varieties of broad-headed man, we have only to add, to complete the evidence at present available, that it is during the period represented by the Neolithic band pottery that we have the first indications of the spread of broad-headed man among the populations of the Danubian region. Northwards, as we've seen, this Danubian culture occupied less lands of Moravia and Bohemia and reached the Middle Rhine. It has also influenced temporarily a large area beyond it in the direction of Belgium. But as the heavily forested ridges of the Carpathians and central German highlands have limited its northward range, so the Vosges and Jura barred extension westward, and it was not long before the Rhine-ward provinces fell under alien influence from the northwest, of which account will be taken later. Southward, its influence is clearly perceptible in later technique of the lake dwellers. But as it never affected Italy, the migration of the Terra Mare builders must have occurred before this phase. Further, to the south of the large western tributaries of the Danube, and especially the Save, received this culture early and developed it in a rather special fashion, which makes the results difficult to correlate with the main Danubian types. Not enough is yet known of this district as a whole to determine whether the remarkably rich settlement at Butmir in Bosnia is typical or not, nor to assign it its proper phase, but it seems certain that spiral ornaments extraordinarily varied and beautiful, which were in vogue there, are on the one hand a local and perhaps spontaneous elaboration of curvilinear elements common to nearly all schools of free field style, and on the other that the Butmir style of pottery, once established, was in wide demand as actual exports show, and had the range of influence even wider from Thessaly and Macedonia to the Carpathians and eventually far beyond towards the Dnieper. What was free field style pottery? Let's look that up. Free field style pottery. Let's see what we get. Oh wow, it's pretty nice actually. This can't, no, but they're showing something that looks like ancient Greek pottery. I can't believe that this is what they're talking about. This can't be it. Well, it is pretty primitive looking. Those are pretty funky looking guys. But they're on a chariot or something. And they haven't mentioned vehicles or anything like that yet. So I don't think that could be what they're talking about. Maybe something more like this. Let's see. They mentioned something about coils. Maybe something like this. Carved lidded jars. I don't know. Oh, yeah, I don't think that we can really look at any of this and because they've got all kinds of things here from different times. So I don't know. Wait, let's see. Stone Age. What if I type Stone Age? That might help. Okay. I think it's probably something more like this. Okay, that's enough of this. Let's go back. It's even been thought, chiefly by Teutonic observers, that the spiral decoration, which became so popular in Minoan Bronze Age of the Aegean, may have resulted from the contact with the Bosnian school. But the contrary view is widely held, and until relative dates of Minoan and Bosnian culture are better established, this question remains open. It may even be that Bosnian culture, lying so near as it does to the Adriatic coast, may have stood in more direct relation than is usually supposed to the Neolithic art of Malta and the West Mediterranean, which also makes striking and very, very early use of spiral decoration. But here too, intercourse cannot be asserted yet, priority even less. Though the general culture, and especially the technique of implements and pottery of the whole of this Danubian region, shows generic similarities, each principal district developed peculiarities of its own, of which those of the Bosnian area are only an exceptionally striking example. And these idiosyncrasies became more marked as time went on. It may be inferred, first, that the various groups of people were on the whole sedentary, as their agricultural habit suggests. Then, from very gradual spread of broad-headed folk among the mainly long-headed population, it would seem that this type of civilization has spread rather by intercourse than by conquest. From the open situation of the settlements and the rarity of weapons of offense, that they were in no great fear of disturbance, and from the frequency of their villages and tombs and the repeated reconstructions of their huts, that this peaceful development lasted a long time. The same gradual and specific advance characterizes also the next noteworthy change. As long as culture remained purely Neolithic, and in most parts of the sum for a while after, the pottery, if it shows any designed interference with the natural color of the clay, is baked black with the aid of smoky fire, or of the charred vegetable matter in the clay itself, or of a dressing of graphite. The surface is burnished by friction, and the incised ornaments are eventually enhanced by a filling of white earth. But about the time of the first introduction of copper, an improved method of firing came into use, which took advantage of the presence of iron oxides in the clay to produce a brick-red surface, or imitated this by a wash of a more ferruginous clay. So I guess with clay with iron in it. Burnishing and white filling went on as before. Now the earliest copper objects, flat axe blades, leaf-shaped daggers, awls, and dress pins. What's an awl? A-W-L. Some kind of pin. Well, that's what a modern awl is. Let's see if I type Stone Age. Yeah, it's some kind of pen, some kind of tool. I better show a picture, right? Or you'll be mad at me. Maybe you'll be mad at me if I don't. Maybe you'll be mad at me if I do. But these are awls. I'm not sure what they're used for. Some kind of pen. Some type of tool. Now the earliest copper objects, flat axe blades, leaf-shaped daggers, awls, and dress pins, repeat with only slight variation the forms characteristic of the earliest Metal Age in pre-dynastic Egypt and in Syria and Cyprus. And the inference of the Danubian region was acquiring its higher industries from the southeast by way of the Hellespont is confirmed by the fact that all over Asia Minor, similar but more emphatic replacement of polished black ware by red ware accompanies the spread of metal working. This is well illustrated in the stratified site of Hisarlik on the Hellespont, where the first city has the black ware and the second and red ware technique. And the second, the redware technique. And the fact that the two settlements are separated by a layer of natural soil, showing that this site was for a while uninhabited, confirms the general impression that whatever intercourse there may have been for Asia Minor into Europe at an early stage, it had ceased for a while and was renewed, and with the importance of the Hisarlik site, when the new metal traffic was becoming frequent and was eliciting a return traffic in amber from the Baltic shores, as the second city seems from its contents to have been destroyed not later than 2000 BC and to have existed for a long while before that catastrophe. We have here a rough lower limit of the period within which this traffic was established, and the foreign objects found in this second city give further cross-references to cultures of other regions, and as far afield as Sicily and Malta, and the third civilization of Anau. Okay, well, I think I'm getting tired. I'm mispronouncing things and getting confused. So I think 2 hours is enough for today. And thank you everybody for watching. And I hope that you come back and you watch when I start with part 5, regional types, the Tripolier culture. We'll start with that, and I'll look up how to pronounce that. Okay. Well, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Subscribe, like, do it all. Goodbye.